My name is Conrad Posch. I'm the graduate coordinator slash admin slash site manager for the Network for a New Political Economy, which is a group started here at Berkeley by Neil Fligstein and Steve Vogel to help us reconceptualize political economy in a post-neoliberal world or a post-neoliberal paradigm. So in light of that, we have three excellent speakers here today talking about sort of macro narratives and macro myths of capitalism. But before we dive in there, I would like to bring to your attention two events, which you'll be getting details about in the next week or two. The first is an event on February 27th with Professor Elizabeth Pop Berman from the University of Michigan, who will be discussing her book, Thinking Like an Economist, in an event co-sponsored with the Sociology Department. Just about a month after that, on March 24th, Professor Jennifer Pitts from the University of Chicago will be discussing Dubois' international thought, Empire, Race, and Political Economy, which focuses on W.B.E. Du Bois' views on the world shadow cast by democratic despotism. It's going to be an interesting year in American politics, that's for sure. But today, as all of you are aware, we're here to discuss the market giveth, the market taketh away. Blessed be the name of the market, with Professors Glory M. Liu of Harvard, Jacob Soll of the University of Southern California, and Brad DeLong from our own University of California, Berkeley. Before I hand the mic over to Glory, I'd like to give a short background on each of our panelists. Glory M. Liu is a lecturer in social studies at Harvard, having previously completed a postdoc at Brown University. She holds a PhD in political science from Stanford University, and her work spans the history of political thought, American politics, and political economy. She is here today to discuss her new book, Adam Smith's America, How a Scottish Philosopher Became an Icon of American Capitalism, just out from Princeton University Press. Jacob Soll is a professor of history and accounting. Oh, Jacob's holding up Glory's book there, at the University of Southern California. He holds a PhD from Magdalene College at Cambridge University. Hope I pronounced that correctly. While his work spans the breadth of accounting, history, and the history of accounting, he's here today discussing his new book, Free Market, The History of a Dream, out from Basic Books. Oh, Glory's now holding up Jacob's book. Very nice. Good synergy there. Which is an analysis of classical philosophy, natural law, history, and contemporary economic culture. Last, but certainly not least, we have J. Bradford DeLong, or Brad DeLong, who's a professor of economics here at UC Berkeley. He's a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. Both Brad and Jacob are holding up Brad's book, which is Slouching Towards Utopia, that tells the story of how an unprecedented explosion of material wealth occurred, how it transformed the globe, and why it failed to deliver us the utopia it promised. So with little more ado, I will hand over the speaker position to Glory to give us an introduction to her book and to how she thinks these three eminent professors fit together in their discussions of capitalism and its history. Glory?
Thank you, Conrad. So first, I want to thank the whole Network for New Political Economy team for putting this event together, especially Conrad and Neil. They did this over the winter break. I also wanted to thank Brad for the original idea of bringing Jake and myself together for this conversation, not to mention plugging both of our books on the Ezra Klein Show. And of course, I wanted to thank Jake and Brad for sharing their work with me and the world. It's really an honor to be in such esteemed company this afternoon. And thank you for your presence here on a Friday afternoon. So the three of us come from three very different disciplines. Well, not too different, depending on who you talk to, but we come from three different disciplines, and we wrote three different books that, on my reading, build on the same set of questions. So first, what are the intellectual origins of free market thinking, an ideology which some people call neoliberalism, and which Brad sardonically captures in the dictum, the market giveth, the market taketh away, blessed be the name of the market. Second, what has made this ideology powerful, useful, and resilient, often to the exclusion of alternative conceptions of a market society? And third, what can these histories tell us about the scope and method of the discipline and enterprise which we call political economy? First, the intellectual origins of free market thinking are as ancient as they are contested, vague, and fraught. Where Brad wants us to read the 20th century as a tug of war between the figurative Karl Polanyi and Friedrich Hayek, Jake wants us to go back to the twilight of the Roman Republic, when Marcus Tullius Cicero envisioned free economic exchange among the virtuous, publicly minded, trustworthy landholding elite. And my book tries to show that a tradition of free market thinking, which uses Adam Smith as a shorthand for the virtues of free markets and the vices of government intervention, has relied on a selective reading of Smith, privileging an economic style of reasoning to the exclusion of Smith's political and historical analysis, not to mention his moral philosophy. And in excavating different parts of this history from different angles, I think the three of us share an ambition to show how the supposed triumph of neoliberal or free market thinking, especially in the 20th century, is neither inevitable nor natural, but rather the product of major ruptures in human history, as well as historical processes of reinterpretation and transmission. Second, the idea of a free market society, or even a free market utopia, is so alluring and so resilient and so powerful because it is malleable. It is susceptible to different configurations to suit a particular context and the demands of the interpreters. So Brad wants us to reread the 20th century as a long century in which the world got wealthier, a lot wealthier. And those moments in which the world got wealthier made the idea of free market society seem even more appealing, either because markets were seen as the reason why the world got wealthier, or because they were a utopian vision for how things could get even more better. But this is not free market fair weather fandom. Jake's work shows us how the very idea of free market was often heavily circumscribed in different historical moments by Republican virtues in the Roman Republic, by the religious doctrines that structured the economy of salvation in late antiquity, by the moral economy of just prices and just exchange in medieval Europe. And he also shows us how the economic theory of the 17th century French economist Jean-Baptiste Colbert, one of the greatest architects of mercantilism, often seen as the nemesis of free trade, was in fact a profoundly political vision of free trade, that the privilege of economic liberty is the state's to give. And I suggest that the ambiguity and underspecificity of the meaning of Adam Smith's politics, or his so-called moral vision of capitalism, is exactly what gives those ideas power and enables them to be so readily adopted and used and weaponized over and over again. So especially in the last 20 years or so, reimagining Smith as a moral philosopher and economist has become incredibly politically powerful on both the left and the right. So the idea of Smith, the moral economist, or Smith's moral economy has become a surprising locus of convergence on both the right and left. And I think it's worth underscoring that the three of us think that this idea of the market giveth, the market taketh, blessed be the name of the market, is of a very recent invention. You don't find this in Cicero, you don't find this in James Madison, and you maybe get at most hints of it in the 19th century German version of Smithianismus, right? This idea of Smith as hyper-egotism, hyper-rationality. But what does give the market genuflectors ammunition is the availability of a constructed tradition that, with heavily rose-tinted glasses, might make it seem like the history of the West is a history of free markets. So finally, I think that we're all adamant about writing histories of economic ideas as histories of moral and political economy. So to the unsuspecting reader, this comes as somewhat of a shock or even a disappointment. Hence, The Guardian's warning that Jake's book is, quote, firmly a work of intellectual history, not of economics, which, quote, some readers may find frustrating. The eminent economic historian Joel Mokyr writes of Brad's book, quote, professional economic historians will notice that there is surprisingly little economics in it. It dwells far more on politics than on economics, which seems, quote, oddly disproportionate for a book written by a professional economist. Now, I'm not about to read quotes from reviews of my own work on a live stream, but you can imagine how one Wall Street Journal reviewer felt about my attempt to recover contending interpretations of Adam Smith. In any case, I don't think it's a coincidence that the three of us felt the need to write these histories around the same time. Post-Great Recession, post-Donald Trump, and now riding into a post-pandemic economy, the public and the academic community alike are beginning to see that we have sufficient historical distance from the age of Thatcher and Reagan and Clinton, yes, looking at you, Gary Gersel, as an aberration in free market society. That until the 70s and the 80s, the notion that the free market was never really free from moral or political institutional constraints, that markets were only free for certain groups of people who possess certain virtues, or that states played a major role in creating the right environments for certain markets to flourish. Moreover, the idea of free market economics still is not morally or politically neutral. At least in the Friedmanite version of Blessed be the market, markets are not only the guarantors of personal freedom, especially freedom of choice, but they also are seen as fostering the conditions for an ethic of capitalism centered on individual responsibility, self-reliance, and innovation. And I think, as our colleague Gary Gersel and I was pleased to hear Elizabeth Pop Berman's book plugged earlier, they've argued in their works, this economic style of reasoning is adopted and entrenched on the technocratic left too. And I think we see this phenomenon, and this is specific to my work, reflected in how different interpreters have taken up the idea of Smith's moral economy. So where neoconservative thinkers like Irving Kristol and Gertrude Himmelfarb might have used the idea of the moral economy to promote a market society that was predicated on traditional family values or wholesome institutions, what we've seen in more recent years, especially among Smith scholars, is a recoding of moral in moral political economy to stand not just for choice, efficiency, self-sufficiency, and choice, efficiency, and self-sufficiency, but rather fairness, equality, and social and distributive justice. But all doing this without abandoning the basic premise that free market capitalism works. Now, this brings me to my last point about the scope and nature of political economy. I think at the most fundamental level, economics is about how we meet our needs. Moral and political economy then is about the institutions, rules, norms, and codes we create to structure the economy to meet our needs. And those institutional rules, norms, and codes are always situated in particular historical, social, and cultural contexts. And I think that that's really what unites the three of these works, that we're really sensitive to this idea of moral and political economy. One of the core themes of my book is what I call the politics of political economy. Ideas about the American political economy are responding to immediate political, economic, and historical circumstances. But the other meaning of that phrase, politics of political economy, is that political economy is a language of authority. Or to put it in Beth Pop Berman's terms, the economic style of reasoning, especially of the sort that is associated with or attributed to Smith's ideas, is so powerful because it often appears to be politically neutral, but it is not. Emphasizing the role of the invisible hand as the miracle of free markets or the centrality of rational self-interest, these are discursive choices with real political import. They structure the way people think about the proper scope of state intervention in the economy, the behavioral motives that matter in understanding economic life, and what we think we owe one another in a market society. So I think one unifying lesson that the three of us want people to take away in our books is this, that the economic logic of free markets isn't value neutral and it isn't politically neutral. And whatever we aspire to replace the dictum of the market giveth, the market taketh, blessed be the market, can't and shouldn't be either. So those are the end of my remarks. I'll hand it back to Conrad, who will then hand off the mic to Brad and Jake.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gloria, for getting us started here. Jake, you are up next. I will swap you in and you may go when you are ready.
Well, thanks to everyone. And thanks to the Center at Berkeley. Thanks to Brad and thanks to Gloria. I mean, that was brilliant. I'm really glad that that was recorded because that is the best sort of overview I've seen of what we're doing and so succinct with all the problems, hiccups. And by the way, it would be interesting at some point to talk and do something about the various responses to our books, because I think they're really revealing and fascinating, sometimes quite upsetting, right? We're authors and we don't like to be torn apart and insulted in public, and many of us didn't expect that to happen with books, which seemed actually anodyne, but we're learning that they're not. Gloria said a lot of things that I would like to, totally, that I wanted to say. So I'm gonna kind of just go off and say something different because she said it so well. So brilliantly. in each of the cases, when I read Brad's book and I read Glory's book, I said, wow, I wish I had had this when I was writing my book. Interestingly, they all came out sort of at the same time. Clearly a movement here. There's something happening, because I was not in contact with Brad or Glory when I wrote my book, but we got in contact pretty quickly afterwards. I needed to complete and do a better job at what I was trying to do, their books. And I think this is really fascinating. I want us to think for a minute here, really seriously, that what Glory did in talking about Smith in America and doing it systematically hadn't been done. That's, I mean, we can come up with all sorts of words, but absurd, crazy, unimaginable. But that is the case. So we have to think that this is literally the kind of symbolic thinker of American economics. And we did not have a history like Glory's until now. Brad did this brilliant job of, again, I called it when we first met, a Keynesian romp, a brilliant job in showing, in once again, showing that how the market can work and does work, and yet then showing its massive fallibilities, but doing it in a way where we talk about expectations and ideas and culture, not just numbers. He mixed it all together. And I think this is really confusing. And this is the final point that I really want to make. What is economic history? Who gets to be an economic historian, and who speaks for economic history? And also importantly, who gets to review our books, right? The field is broken into pieces. There are formal economic historians. I'm writing an article about this now. There are economist historians. There are journalist historians. There are media superstars, people like Brad, who can work in all these different fields. There is also a real problem of symmetry between the scholarly realm, the media realm. It's often very hard. How does one respond to major newspapers attacking one's book when one is just a professor and doesn't have a media sort of post? How do you deal with this issue? The field is in flux, but I think this is actually really interesting. And once again, Glory showed the possibilities. It's just beginning. If we're at a point where we're getting our first serious book on Adam Smith in America, I want us to think of all the amazing opportunities that we have. The only issue in that is that the reason these books haven't been written, I believe, is because these myths are so powerful in the United States. And I'm curious to hear how Brad and Glory felt about the reception of their books, for example, in Britain. In America, I've been roundly attacked on an almost daily basis by the right. And in Britain, there's been no issue with my book, none. So we have these really interesting cultures. How do you break myths? Well, in political history, this wouldn't have happened. Words like reason of state, terms like the state have been studied and genealogies have been given. Words like mercantilism, we've been fighting to sort of get this to change this word, because Smith uses it and no one uses it really before that. He doesn't use it in the way we use it. To a historian trained like me in Cambridge, you can't use anachronistic words without talking about it. Economic history is filled with anachronisms. That's part of why it's so alive also. So we're in this odd business of myth busting now. It's important, it's exciting, it's also hard, and even kind of upsetting because of the attacks. But it does show the vibrancy, and that clearly a nerve has been hit, and that there is a moment. And I think it's exciting. And I think we need to have a lot more discussions about what economic history is, what we're trying to do, and how we can do it. And I think this is a fantastic opportunity for that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Jake. And Brad, would you like to give us your opening remarks? And then we'll have give you guys a chance to converse back and forth. Brad, you are muted.
First, yes.
Thank you.
Let me back up and let me talk about the origins of the idea that people ought to be individuals, and individuals could become free and prosperous in a market economy if they were given space, in order to break the feudal bonds of subservience and subjection that held them to their lords and move to the city. if they were able to break the guild restrictions that prevented them from entering any particular craft, and if they were free to make contracts based on their skills and ability to work, rather than whether they would claim to have ancestors who had come across the Rhine with Clovis, king of the Franks, or had a patent of nobility gained because they had been sufficiently obsequious and had been willing to lend sufficiently good money on sufficiently good terms to some Valois king in the past. That Friedrich Engels would have said that the transformation from the feudal organization of society in 1000 to what I would call the society of the commercial imperial revolution of the gunpowder empires of 1700 had taught people that they were, by and large, individual, largely self-sufficient producers engaged not in distributing resources according to custom or hierarchy, but in a market in which they could make and fulfill contracts and so get closer to a realm of freedom. Now, Engels thought this would inevitably pass. That the era of the commercial imperial revolutions, the era of the gunpowder empires, would be followed by the era of steam and of the factory, and of the very large-scale division of labor within the enterprise itself, and the extraordinary complicated societal division of labor, and the idea that one was in some sense an individual producing things, rather than just one more chain in an enormous interdependent dance of the societal division of labor, in which we were all social beings whose ability to produce was based upon our close social bonds. Well, this would produce the habit of mind that Engels called socialism, in which, of course, we are all incredibly interdependent. Of course, we are all incredibly needed and useful in the social division of labor. Of course, we should all be equal and free. And, the administrative jobs that have to be done, since we're no longer in the business of oppressing each other by claiming a higher place, well, we rotate through those as the government of men is replaced by the administration of things. But it really did not happen. It did not go that way. Indeed, the people who are the most coggish and the most interdependent parts of our now even much more complicated societal division of labor, the programmers of Silicon Valley, are somehow the people who seem to be most certain that they are autonomous individuals creating valuable things all by themselves over their own mind stuff, even though the failure of a computer they do not even know exists can cause their entire workday to collapse completely. This is a very odd thing, the persistence of this individualism and the hope that the market will help us become free. And it takes a number of ways. We have Friedrich von Hayek with the anticipatory neoliberal despair at government, even or perhaps especially democratic government, that all government can do at the moment is undergo some Lycurgan moment in which it reestablishes order and tells people to stop butting into the market, and then goes away and lets people be their individual market selves. You have Milton Friedman. I remember I had lunch with him in North Beach early in this millennium, who said he'd always hated Karl Polanyi and the belief of social justice. That, remember, Milton Friedman was a guy who was fired from the University of Wisconsin because the Wisconsin legislature thought it was not just that the economics department have another Jew. And in a market economy, you get a kind of social justice in which if you are useful to others, you can get a claim on resources, as opposed to getting a claim on resources only if the legislators of the state of Wisconsin decide that you are of the right religion. And once you lose your job, then you have to go to New York and beg your dissertation's advisor, Simon Kuznets, for a more or less clerical job, and then try to scrabble up again. Now, we, or at least we left neoliberals, would say, well, yes, the market economy has enormous excellences, but it also has the enormous problem that the only rights the market economy recognizes are property rights. And so the only people who actually have any social power are those who were lucky and fortunate to have been able to grab the last bunch of property rights in the last go-round. And that this does not produce a good society, one in which if you do not have wealth, your desires and demands are literally invisible to the market. So social democrats, left neoliberals, call for predistribution or redistribution or large-scale public provision of good things, and saying that the market economy has its powerful place, provided that you can successfully deal with externalities and successfully manage aggregate demand and have everyone have enough of a claim to a universal basic income that their voice counts in the market, that they have social power. Yet the social democratic order, the New Deal order, as Gary Gersel would call it, even the left neoliberal order, attempts at order of Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, it could not win durable political majorities. There seem to be very strong objections to the idea that people are by their nature as citizens entitled to have social power, that people need to be seen as proper contributors to society before they're allowed a voice. And sometimes it's whether they bring resources to the party, and sometimes, as in the case of Crystal and Himmelfarb's view of society, you have to have the right cultural attitudes, and so be reinforcing the forward march of bourgeois civilization as we march down the centuries, or being the race, or right now, off in another window on my screen, there's a huge kerfuffle about the effective altruism movements and various of its participants extremely close flirting with saying that the only people who really count are those who happen to have exactly the right genetic endowment. And the right genetic endowment is the one that leads you to get very high scores on the tests that various EA members got very high scores on. This is an enormous problem for us as we try to think, how should we move beyond a neoliberal, the market giveth, the market taketh away, blessed be the name of the market, order that right now absolutely nobody is satisfied with.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you, Brad. That ended on a very provocative point, especially about effective altruism, which is something that I've been keeping track of over the years since first.
I love giving lots of money to poor people for programs that actually work, as opposed to programs that flatter donors. But it's moved away from that over the past 5 years in some strange and weird ways.
And last I had heard, it was giving kidneys undirectedly, but it's an interesting movement if people have not followed it. But to shift us back into the discussion of the market, Lori, since you went first, I'm going to give you the first chance to either respond to what your co-panelists have said, to ask them questions, and then we'll take it a bit organically from there.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for those provocations and questions, and really flattered by the nice words you said, Jake. I stand on the shoulders of giants, so even if it took this long for one book to come out in this way, I hope there will be many more, especially correctives to the many deficiencies in this book. I wanted to just start by the question that I thought was really, really pointed from Jake. How do you go about breaking myths, right? I never thought about this book as being a mythbuster book. Interestingly, I really didn't want to write a myth-busting book because I thought that a lot of contemporary scholarship on Smith coming from political theorists was doing the myth-busting, right? Smith is not a Chicago-style economist. Let me show you all the ways in which he is a sympathetic liberal. Let me show you all the ways in which he is a political realist, or a kind of alternative to the Kantian style of moral philosophical reasoning, or these multidimensional ways of showing that Smith is not an economist. And I wrote this book to really answer the question, why did we get Smith the economist? And in doing so, I was trying to bust a different kind of myth, but as I realized, myths die really hard. But I think that my approach, at least, and maybe this is just my own sensibility as like an intellectual historian and political theorist, is that one way you bust a myth is not to show the alternative, but to show that the myth was constructed for a specific purpose at a specific time, and that it didn't have to be that way. What I think what's interesting, we kind of hinted at like a reception of the receptions, is that a lot of people really focus on the chapters that I spend on the Chicago School for good reason. But I was also very careful in saying, like, look, the Chicago School looms really large in my story about the transformation of Adam Smith, but there are lots of other things that happened in the 20th century and other people reading and writing about Smith in the 20th century. But I think the reason why that has really been a lightning rod in the reception of my book is because either you have people thinking that the way that I'm trying to show that this myth of Adam Smith tied to kind of the invisible hand and the magic of the market and self-interest, right? The Friedmanite version of Smith was Friedman's construction. And they think, well, that's got to be totally wrong, because how could you possibly not believe in the myth of the invisible hand? So that goes over their head. So either I'm being too critical or I'm not being critical enough. And it's been interesting to see that range of responses to my attempt to not exactly myth bust, but to complicate and to historicize a moment of transmission and kind of reimagination. Again, I think that's one way of going about myth busting, but it's a really difficult way. Like, I chose a really difficult way to do that. I guess, I'll stop there so other people have a chance to speak, but I just want to kind of add a second vote for Jake's question, especially to Brad, who's the card-carrying economist, about like, how do we do economic history in an era of kind of post-neoliberal thinking?
Mm-hmm. And it really is it's not just Milton Friedman, right? That, Paul Samuelson, Milton got fired from Chicago by the public sector for being Jewish. Paul Samuelson got fired by the private sector from Harvard for being Jewish and had to go down the river to MIT. And thereafter, he still had the very strong New Deal orientation, pro-New Deal orientation that he and Friedman had both shared in the 1930s as young whippersnappers. But Samuelson was always enormously contemptuous of private power, rich people, and WASP elites in the way that Milton Friedman was not thereafter. And there is a good joint biography to be written there, at least.
Oh, yeah.
I will always be disappointed that I never asked Paul Samuelson why he pushed the invisible hand so very hard, when he knew as well as I did that in the context of The Wealth of Nations, the invisible hand metaphor is used not to describe an example in which rational agents transacting in the market produce an optimal outcome. It's used to refer to a decision in which people's irrational wish to have their goods under their own eye so that they can physically see and touch them, that irrational urge produces enough of an extra desire to bring things to you, yet that you get the benefits of all of the thick market externalities of a well-functioning central kind of economic port area like Amsterdam. It's not the market is great, it is that there are two possible disruptions to the market system. One, that there is an extra sociological advantage to gathering people together in dense areas and cities, and the other, that people have this want to see and touch and feel rather than just process symbols. And those two just happen to miraculously reinforce each other so that humanity is led as if by an invisible hand to become maximally prosperous.
I would take that further, Brad, and say that within the context of Smith's thought and of Stoic thought and of all the language he's using, he is really talking about society, that hopefully these market actors will be driven not by government decisions, but by this greater moral force that society hopefully can produce. And so it's not just economic, right? It's going to be, this is why he harks back to agriculture and why he favors it, but he doesn't believe that a government should favor it. One thing, by the way, I wanted to just go back to Glory's point, and then I wanted to make another point. And I think this also connects, we do have this problem, again, of asymmetry and of people speaking all these different languages and all these different worlds of economic history. I wanted to go back to Samuelson because he's in this article I'm writing right now. Perhaps you're familiar with his analysis of Quenet's tables. And it's complete nonsense historically. I mean, at the time, even people in France in the 18th century were saying, look, you don't have any data to do this with. Not only is your idea that business and industry are sterile, not only does that not work, but your actual economic data is no good. And there's a guy named Bonnet, who nobody remembers, but is really one of the most important thinkers of the time, who actually goes over Quenet's data and shows that it's bad. Samuelson comes into this just assuming that it's all correct. And this is what happens when you're not a historian. Samuelson's analysis of Quenet is probably more influential than most works on Quenet because he's a famous economist. And so this is one of these huge problems that we have right now. So Glory, how do people like you and me respond to attacks by, I don't know what to call them, right-wing, neoliberal, Rupert Murdoch, the Koch brothers? I always look at who's actually paying the bills of the people who are actually attacking me. And some just, individuals working on their own. And this gets back to Brad. We're in this world with all these power dynamics in economic history. And what Brad, I think you described so well, was we're lacking concepts, or we're stuck with these old concepts that are completely out of date in this new world. I think that's one of the reasons your book struck such a chord, is you were able to find these terms in which to smoothly critique the situation, so you could both get your point across in an incredibly strong way without completely freaking the right out. I think that was like a brilliant success of your book. But we're stuck with these conceptual terms, and we're stuck with asymmetries. And the myth busters, I do think, they're not at a total disadvantage. We're all here together, but it's going to be an interesting negotiation, and I'm not sure how that's going to work. It's going to take time. By the way, the history of the attempts to put mercantilism into a historic framework start really with D.C. Coleman and Jacob Viner. I mean, a long, long time ago. We shouldn't, and this isn't, a criticism of anyone, but historically we shouldn't be using the word. This has been going on for, I don't know how long, since Viner started it, Coleman started it, and we're still using the term. Think about what that means. How hard is, these are some of the greatest economic historians and greatest economic figures of all time have already had this discussion a long, long time ago, and we're still struggling with it well over a half century later. So I do think that we're making headway, and this is an interesting time, but we're also up against our own various fields and how they interact together. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense to me. I think one rather niche example of this attempt to kind of resolve anachronism is the distinction between capitalism versus commercial society in Smith, right? Smith never uses the term capitalism. And we being Smith scholars and historians of political thought, prefer to use what Smith used, commercial society. But when we start making claims about how Smith had this moral vision of commercial society, or that he had a moral defense of commercial society, we're also doing something weird there too, because Smith actually uses the term commercial society just twice in The Wealth of Nations. And it's a very, very precise category to denote the internal organization and relations of kind of exchange of how society is internally organized. But we've kind of gotten to this point where we have such a need, I think, to read back onto many of these thinkers that we're willing to expand these categories in ways that wouldn't have been available to the thinkers at the time. And I'm not going to be one to get into the kind of like presentism debate here. I think it's incredibly fruitful to be reading The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations and the lectures on jurisprudence, but it's also it raises a new set of problems and questions when you start kind of making that further conceptual leap to saying, well, commercial society is now basically a stand-in for capitalism, because we need to somehow look back to Smith for a kind of ethical defense of capitalism when that's not really there either. So Jake, I think the question that you asked is just like, it's a never-ending problem, even when we try our best.
There is a sense in which the clock kind of stopped. Yeah, that Smith and a bunch of other people were indeed believers in stage theories. Yeah, right? That you go from hunting and gathering to, what is it, shepherding comes next, and then you go to agriculture, and then you go to, commercial society, or at least to post-agricultural urban whatever. And that's where Smith is, and Engels says, well, no, we're going on to the steam power society, and the steam power society will be as different as from commercial society as commercial society was from feudalism. And, we will indeed have a new world, right? The New Jerusalem will descend because the very mode of production and relations of production of steam power society will produce socialist attitudes in the minds of the people, and we will all be happy, rich, and equal. And for some people, the clock stopped with commercial society, that it's all essentially been the same since 1650. And then the disciples of Engels, well, they tend to have stopped in 1870 and to keep waiting for the socialist train to arrive. And, there are various expedients. There's capitalism, there's late capitalism, there's Fordism. I pick up my New Left review, which I never agree with, but always find stimulating, and find that now it's techno-feudalism. And in some sense, the fact that the clock stopped for the great transformation, either at commercial society or at steam power, is one thing that is very much hindering us in thinking about what our mode of production and communication and exchange and domination now actually is.
All right.
I
This ends actually. I want to give one last call to see if y'all would like to ask anything of each other, and then move to audience Q&A.
By the way, Brad, it's interesting you bring up technologies, and Gloria, you did it too. And I think also this gets to, I'm still thinking about Brad's book and its effects, right? It is the beauty of language. Brad, I don't want to belittle you or aggrandize you in the wrong way, but I do think a lot of what you've been able to do is because of the way you were able to use language and concepts. And I think that's really fascinating. And also then your authority as an economist. It's just super, super interesting how that all worked, right? And I think that we're prisoners, or we're living in this world of these terms and tools, and it's really rich, it's really complex. But I do think that we need to now sort of make a call, and these don't always work. It just might be a rhetorical statement, but we did it in social history, we did it in intellectual history, we did it in the history of politics, a call for a kind of general methodology, a general coming together of the field. It could be an argument, right? Because that's how it happened in the social history of ideas, as Robert Darnton put it in 1970 in the Journal of Modern History, which is one of the most influential articles about historical method that exists, and really brilliant stuff that doesn't exist in economic history in the same way. I really do think it's time for us to sit down and talk about all this, and not do it, as someone suggested, by tweets. I think we actually need big seminars and long discussions and articles about this, because I'm startled by all these books at how conceptual and linguistic frameworks have led us into these crazy places. But when you start making economic policy on them, it can have staggering effects, as Brad shows.
Well, but this has always been the human problem, right? The fact that in Greek, the words for spirit, ghost, soul, wind, breath, and fart are all the same thing, is what leads some of the Pythagoreans to say that you should not eat beans because it will try to destroy your soul, or so I've been told.
Yes, but they are good for your heart. At least
yes.
That's what I was taught when I was a kid.
That we are more prisoners of our languages and our concepts than we would wish to be.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, on that fragrant note, I will allow Benjamin Grasty to ask our first question.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for this panel. This is really interesting. My question is around how do we redefine the order of the market if most of the political class or those elite or those with kind of power, in my understanding, have a shared agreement of the neoliberal order, kind of starting from Reagan, trickle down economics never really trickled down, and kind of the benefits of unregulated markets is that wealth can kind of consolidate towards the top. So how do we reform? And that's kind of my understanding of the populist backlash on the left with Bernie Sanders and on the right with Trump. So, and that's had limited success on both sides. So how do we redefine the order of the market when elected officials don't necessarily represent those concerns?
Well, what we're doing is we can simply try to think more clearly and to figure things out. At the level of politics, right, that we now have an extremely narrow Republican congressional majority, which on the one hand contains huge numbers of people who very much want to reinforce Donald Trump saying that the old Republican Party was bankrupt because it did not pay enough attention to the little guy and was too much the Wall Street Party of the Bushes and so forth. And on the other hand, they're about to go out and at least hold votes on massive, massive cuts to Social Security and Medicare spending. And these two things really do not compute at all. So I'd say there's been a large failure at the political level at drawing the connections between what the mechanisms of government are actually doing and what the rhetorical aspirations of the people you're voting for are. And unless we can iron out that great gap, we're going to have a very difficult time getting good democratic governance here in America over the next 50 years.
Gloria, did you want to say something?
I can say something, but go for it.
I just want to say, as sort of scholars and writers, one of the things we can do, and there's argument about this within the field, trying to reach a broader audience and this presentism issue, and what can scholars do? It's very, very hard. One of the things that I've noticed, and Brad manages to avoid this because he is skilled at using language and he has personal subversive tendencies. The problem is it often falls into simplification. And I don't know if you read financial press, but we do have historians, I would say, dangerously simplifying. And I would actually even wager to think that some of the attacks on my book come because I have noted that before I left Twitter, because it wasn't helping me out to keep pointing that out. But I think it's extremely, we have this problem where we need to communicate, but if we start simplifying, we spout nonsense. And that is even more dangerous when the people who actually know the complexities throw them out for certain simplifications. So that, I think, is yet another danger when we fall into the populist trap. This is super, super hard. We have to start somewhere though, right? And the fact that books, let's say nerdier books within these three books are being attacked at such a high level is showing that we're hitting some kind of nerve, and this is partially working. Somebody still thinks it's worth attacking scholarly books, even illegitimately. That's actually kind of important. But where we go from here, again, it's going to be more hard work and slogging, and how it gets into political discourse, into a general realm of discussion is going to be really hard when major newspapers no longer seriously review scholarly books. And this is something we talk about in the field all the time. At this point, if you want a review of a serious work of history, you will only find it in a specialized journal for the most part. And if a serious work of history is being reviewed in a big newspaper, it's most often by a journalist. It's I'm not all the time, but almost all the time, there's a sense in my field that our grander voice in society, and this happened in France a while ago, where Le Monde stopped doing serious, real scholarly reviews. We do have a problem. So I don't know if there's an easy answer to your question from where we're coming from. Sorry, Gloria.
No, don't apologize. So my answer to the question is a slightly different take. I don't have policy advice. I don't even know if I have personal advice, but I guess I have an intellectual framework for how to think about, how do we rethink the market order? How do we rethink the problems of the modern economy, such as they are in, let's say, 2023, the United States? And I think here Smith is actually quite illuminating if we get Smith right. I think there's a tendency to think of like the market economy in the dicta, right, of the market given, the market taken, but blessed be the name of the market. But Smith thought about a market society in political terms, right? The conflicts of the modern economy weren't between atomistic individuals pursuing their self-interest. He really saw economic problems at the level of kind of orders is the word he uses, but we might call them classes, right? So he says that the real threat to the modern economy, even he doesn't use the term the modern economy, right? But he really sees the real threats to growth and to the health and happiness of the 18th century British economy as coming from what he calls the impertinent jealousy of merchants and manufacturers, right? He's talking about economic elites and the way that they collude and capture legislators in order to pass restrictive monopolistic policies, right? That is a form of state capture and economic oppression. And I think that when we see how Smith thinks about economics and politics as inextricably linked, right? That politics really is about like domination and who gets to dominate the economy, and the economy is determined by these political forces, such as the fact that employers are always going to have the law on their side. That's why Smith says that when you look at when workers are trying to clamor for legislation, you can always trust that they're just, because the law is usually slanted in favor of employers so that they can collude to depress wages, whereas workers are often prevented by law from organizing, right? So Smith gives us a clue into how we think about the politics that structure economic relations. And I think that when we get that version of Smith in our mind, we actually can see the parallels in how the modern economy works today, right? That it's not just like the invisible hand and these impersonal forces, but it's about how different groups have different power that's structured by political processes that ultimately determine who the economy works for, who the market works for.
All right, thank you. Next up, we have Rebecca Spang. Let me add her in here and unmute her.
Hi, everybody. Typical annoying senior scholar, I actually have a fast bibliographical suggestion and then a funny anecdote and then a question. Bibliographical suggestion. I wonder if part of the problem is that we're so much the legacy of 18th century Scottish Enlightenment that we keep thinking in terms of stages, even when we know there isn't a next stage. Mm-hmm. So what can we do to try to think about economy, society, culture, not in terms of stages, right? And what I find most helpful is the Brodel version of capitalism, where there are some capitalists and they're doing capital stuff. And then there are some people who really, they're not part of that. I mean, they live on the same planet, but we don't necessarily, even, in the globalized world of today, necessarily all sort of interact in the same circuits. And if we call attention to that fact, that can help. And you could say the same thing about generations. If you call attention to how different it is to be 6 years old right now and 60, maybe we'll notice different things about the workings of the economy and society and be able to write against a sort of stadial notion of the world. So that's my bibliographical suggestion. My funny anecdote, 20 years ago, when my book, The Invention of the Restaurant, first came out, the reviewer in the TLS said, "This can't be true because I never read it before." So actually, myth breaking, even if it's about something that would seem so anodyne as why are there restaurants, right? I mean, what I argue in my restaurant book, is that the restaurant was a key locus for market-based individuality, right? Just exactly along with these themes. And, this cuisine guy didn't want to read that. He just wanted recipes. So it's a funny thing that, people hold on tight to their myths. But my question was going to be about national contexts. Nobody mentioned Gareth Stedman Jones's book, An End to Poverty. And what Gareth argues there is that it's the French Revolution that triggers a considerable rereading of Smith and a much narrowing of Smith and a sort of ignoring of those parts of Smith, whereas Glory says, Smith says, look, this isn't good for workers. We care about the wealth of the nation, not the nabobs. What are we going to do for the entire nation? So I'm just wondering what the three of you would say about the impact of particular political events. I'm particularly fond of the French Revolution, but it could be 1848, it could be the Russian Revolution, it could be 1989. How have those events changed readings and thinkings and writings about economic history?
I have always been very attracted by, Gareth Stedman Jones's take, and looking at Dugald Stewart, I think, as the chief of those who are trying to defend Smith's memory and Smithians and the Smithian community and the Scottish Enlightenment in general, against, say, call it a proto-McCarthyite reaction, that you people are too close to the French philosophers and look what happened as a result of them. Our landlord-based English society can't have a place for you, and Dugald Stewart is frantically paddling back and saying, yes, it does. Look, it's not all that radical. He's not all that this. And that as establishing a way of reading Smith so you can then take the wealth of nations and pull it into a kind of technocratic debate on the Corn Laws, say, is something that, I would love to have someone write a big book on it, and my sophomore social studies tutor, Shannon Stimson, might well be the person to do it. But she has lots of other fish to fry.
We should also give Smith some agency here, because he had the chance. I mean, as I note in the book, and I do think this is important, that this is the guy that gave office space to James Watt, and he did miss. There's a real difference in talking about people interacting to build nails as opposed to machinery. He missed the first industrial revolution. He missed the abolitionist movement. He missed a whole bunch of stuff that was going on. And we can attribute all these things to him, but he also was sitting there very carefully revising all of those books until 1790. Even as someone like Joseph Priestley is getting chased out of, I don't know if he dies before or after Priestley is chased out of Britain and has to run to Philadelphia for supporting the French Revolution. But Smith is a very canny, to use a Scottish term, a very canny author and a very canny handler of his own reputation. And he can reform himself. And by the way, I make this clear in the book. He's very much dependent on this landed elite whom he lives off of and admires, lives with, and they make his career. And in this, he's this very kind of Lockean, he comes from a landowning family himself, a small one, he lived with his mom for a long time.
Yeah.
So I think that Smith himself starts realizing where his career can go and starts curating it a bit. And then I think that he could never have foreseen where it would go, but he definitely, he burns his papers. And this is something that's really important. Why? Well, he's very, very aware of what happens to Hume when Hume's atheism comes into view, and Hume can't get a job in the Scottish University. And Smith is really, really careful about his own radicalism. You have to think of Hume as a professor trying to make a buck and a reputation. That's how I think of him. And he's really worried about his reputation, his book, and his multiple salaries.
Combination of a professor and of someone who also wants a job at a Koch brothers think tank.
Exactly. I mean,
only it's the Rockingham Whigs, and it's Charles Townsend wanting a tutor for the Duke of Buccleuch, as rather than the Koch brothers as the people they want to make their compromises to, and live healthily and happily and wealthily off of.
But I think I think that there are these huge events that are happening. Remember, Smith is around for a little bit of it, and we can look at his power in re-editing his books and see how it gets on this trajectory, which then kind of goes really crazy as far as I'm concerned. I think as Glory shows better than anyone I've ever seen. But this is all about historical context. This is the kind of complexity that gets lost on the Liberty Fund website and other places where I was attacked 48 hours ago and called illiterate and dishonest, or either or both. But so I do think that this kind of nuance for us as we sit here, oh, great, take that out there. And it's a remarkably hard job. And I do think, Gloria, what I saw in your work was this incredible care that I did not take because of my lack of admiration, as I've talked about with Brad, for Hayek and Friedman. I just don't admire them at all. Quite the contrary. But you were so careful to kind of stay out of that and to really try and make this just a clear reading of what they did. I admired that, and I thought that it too was canny and really, really smart and a good way to go. Eventually, you're going to get dragged down in a certain amount of mud after that, but still. And how much nuance do we lose when we defend ourselves and when we enter into a higher sphere of public discussion? I don't know. These are really hard questions. No?
Possibly it's because I'm sufficiently schizophrenic that I don't know whether I'm safe or whether pieces of me are safe. Because I really can enthusiastically talk about how von Hayek and how Smith, as an anticipator of him, are true geniuses in seeing the potential wisdom of a market and of a catalytic system. And I can go back to classical Athens and talk about the Demos of Athens constructing the statue of Athena Promachos, Athena fighting in front from 90 tons of copper and 10 tons of tin. And where do the 10 tons of tin come from? And nobody in Athens actually knows where the tins of actually come from. And Herodotus can't find anyone to tell him. And yet the market knows. And the market tells people in Cornwall, you need to mine 10 tons of tin and ship it across the channel and up the Seine and over to the Rhone Valley and down to Massilia and then to Syracuse and then to Athens, so that the Demos of Athens can construct this 90-ton statue. That there is a great kind of wisdom of the system there. And I suppose as long as I can say that, all of my left-wing friends look at me as though I've gone completely and totally insane.
There was some state
intervention. My right-wing friends say I can't be totally lost.
Brad, I know we're running close to time. Oh, sorry.
Wasn't there a lot of state intervention in that interaction, though, over that statue?
Yes, you can't sail a ship in the Mediterranean without running into a pirate, right?
So what's a market? What's a market?
I'll just really, really quickly add to some of the answers to this question. So on the French Revolution, I generally agree with a lot of the really good historiography that's been done. Emma Rothschild really showing that the French Revolution and Dugald Stewart's eulogy and biography in 1792, I believe, It's like read out loud and then it's published posthumously, really produces the first image of a kind of conservative, technocratic, tries to neutralize Smith, right? Takes the most subversive parts out, distances him from the more revolutionary reading, and turns him into somebody kind of polite and neutral. But that's not the only time that happens, right? And I think that the history of reading Smith is the history of non-neutral transmissions. It's always about kind of politically infusing Smith or trying to defuse him of some political association. So you asked about kind of other events and other instances where we get suddenly a very politically charged Smith. Across the 19th century in the United States, it's the tariff that's one of the front and center issues. Yes, slavery, but the tariff is another way to get around the issue of talking about slavery, because suddenly you're talking about who are we taxing and what vision of national economy are we producing when we tax international goods. That's a way of conceptualizing political economy without having to talk about slavery. And Smith gets, kind of conscripted into these conversations, and suddenly it becomes an ideological position to be associated with Smith because Smith becomes the apostle of free trade, right? Suddenly we get this really whittled down version of Smith. And then I think in the 20th century, again, this is like one of the big turning points in my book, after the Great Depression, a lot of American economists who are kind of all over the map in terms of methodology start really questioning the core assumptions of free market liberalism. And so there's this kind of return to try to revive some of the tenets of free market liberalism in the shadow of a kind of change in the discipline. And so that's why we get this neoliberal Smith, right? Because this group of intellectuals, from the LSE to Vienna to Chicago, is really conscientiously, deliberately trying to create a version of Smith that fits in with their version of a kind of revived liberalism. So those are just some kind of historical events that, I think in my mind, really produce a different, very politically charged version of Smith.
All right. Next up, we have David Grewal of the Berkeley Law. Berkeley Law. Give me 1 second to add the spotlight.
Oh, I hope David talks about the French Revolution.
And then move spotlight. All right.
Mute yourself, David.
David, all yours.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I hesitate to raise a sort of what could be a long question, not my question, but the answer is. So hopefully we can just keep it short, and if it doesn't resonate, just move on. But I was wondering about whether you thought, and first, thank you for your books and yada yada. It's great to be in dialogue. I wonder whether you thought that beneath the various metaphors and the kind of linguistic terms that I think Jake and Glory drew attention to, and also Brad, there's something like I don't know what else to call it besides like a presumed or an implied kind of social geometry that's underlying market thinking from roughly this turn. I think of it sometimes about the difference between triadic and bilateral social geometry, and a triangular social geometry would always have a third party who's in an implicit process of judging the two parties. And sometimes what I think classical political economy does is it shifts from the triadic social geometry that's like commonplace in 17th century social contract theory to an essentially bilateral or dyadic social geometry, which is then basically secretes a theory like exchange value, which is why Aristotelian exchange value comes back. And once you have a dyadic social geometry, then you're going to be constantly pushed into questions about value in exchange, value in transaction. And then you can say that it's buffered by morality, it's buffered by law, it's buffered by institutions. But in a sense, you have a gravitational pull back to some idea of value, which is why there's the constant peregrinations of the theory of value from this time on. We know that value is the answer, and then we just keep revising the question. And it's not because we got the wrong metaphor or the wrong terms, but it's because we're constantly pulled back to a dyadic social geometry. I don't know what you all think about that, or whether there's something else. Society, Jake mentioned, but could there be a metaphor under the metaphors, which is what's doing the work and why it's so hard to dislodge this to your points earlier? Thank you.
And it's a great question. Could I ask a clarification first about the geometry? Could you just pinpoint, sorry, my monkey brain is just not working very well right now, but pinpoint, like, what are the points on the triad and what are the points on the dyad?
Just take the state of nature conceit that you find in Hobbes and Locke and compare it to the nature conceit you have with Smith, but with Turgot, or going back to Bois-Guilbert. In one of them, you've got basically three people and there's the need for a judge to sort out the fighting, the first one. And in the second one, you've got two people and they've got things to trade with each other. And the third is at most an implicit judge.
Okay.
And so you shift from a trilateral to a dyadic social geometry as the whole basis of society. And if you make that move, then sure, we can keep buffering the market and saying what we do or don't like about it, but aren't we going to keep being drawn back to it and assuming that there's something like exchange value that just keeps getting secreted by humanity or society?
The question is, how deep does this go?
Well,
I mean, do we want to say that chimpanzees reinforce their social bonds because they can't pick parasites off of the fur on their backs by themselves, and so they need to groom each other, and that we, because we're hairless and find it easy to pick parasites off our back, that we instead have evolved a kind of, we solidify our social bonds via acts of individual reciprocal gift exchange, in which you do not always want to be the one always taking advantage of the other, but you also don't always be the sucker who's giving things, and that this underpins human sociability at a very deep level, as the book The Company of Strangers argues. Do you want to say that it's more recent than that it comes out of the Indo-European domestication of horses and then boiling out of the steppe, with this guest-host relationship between males at the core of their society, and that is in some sense beneath everything and keeps us from understanding what our society really is, except if you're Hobbes and are able to see deeper? These are questions that are far, far above my pay grade.
Let me try and take a stab at this question, David. And I'm going to answer by way of not really answering it. So I guess it depends on whether you see the dyads being like I guess, okay. So I guess it depends on if you think that Smith thinks that the social geometry of society itself is composed of a bunch of dyads.
Perfect.
Right? Or if Smith has just a view that society itself is a thing, right? Like kind of proto-Durkheimian, like society is a thing and society is a unit. And our relations in society may be dyadic or they might be multilateral, but they certainly aren't governed by a top-down relation the way that it is governed in a kind of Hobbesian social contract, right, in triadic. I do think that that's right. And I think where you see maybe the durability of that reconceptualization of society is, again, like maybe an aggregation of dyadic relationships, or maybe just we think society is a thing and we don't need this intervening judge. That endures in Hayek, right? And that's why I think Hayek's interpretation of the invisible hand is actually really powerful and really important, because what he's saying about the invisible hand is like, this is how society works, right? He's not saying this is how the market works. He's saying that there is diffuse epistemic power in what we know from like our local interactions. It's an epistemic social theory, not a theory of kind of price, the way that Hayek sees it. I think that is closer to how Smith views society, the underlying geometry of society, than Friedman's version of the invisible hand. So maybe that kind of answers your question.
That's super helpful, and you got it. Thanks.
All right. Well, I'm going to call a little bit of an audible here for the queue and ask Teoman to come up next for us, please. Give me 1 second to swap the videos. Oop, I clicked the wrong button. And there we go. And then Teoman, you can now unmute. Floor is yours.
All right, I think I'm unmuted. Thank you, Conrad. So first, I want to agree that Smith definitely doesn't fit our caricature of neoliberalism. And I see what you guys are saying about how he's, wary of merchants. He's also wary of idolatry of the rich. He barely mentions the invisible hand, only in the context of home bias, which is totally different from how it's used today. But I want to argue that nevertheless, he fits really neatly with the actual discourse of contemporary economists, who, as you all know, are not actually like completely diehard like neoliberals. He argues that free trade might indeed cause dislocations for some people, but he goes on to suggest that soldiers coming home faced a similar situation coming home from war as workers whose jobs were exported overseas. So we shouldn't worry because they did just fine and the workers will too. So doesn't this sound exactly like what economists have been saying for the last few decades about globalization? Like, yes, you're right. There could be some like, temporary issues, but we think it'll all just sort out and we'll handle it. And recently they sort of self-revised that a little bit, but that sounds very economist-y to me. Similarly, he's for public education, right, up to a certain age. But when it comes to public universities, just like today's economists, he's like, no, they're just, it's not working. We need tuition to make sure those, professors actually, do their jobs and teach our students. Research isn't important. And so doesn't that sound like exactly what we hear today? And that's why, we're paying. Yeah, exactly. He visits Oxford and he says, these guys are all lazy. They're not really doing anything over here. Like this is what Ronald Reagan said about the UC. This is why we pay tuition and not tax dollars to fund it. So I know the project of intellectual history that you're all basically involved in from different fields is to sort of reinterpret seminal texts instead of trying to move past them, because that might not be possible. But my question is, why not? Because what you're saying is, okay, he was funded by rich people. He sort of was rich, so he had this bias. Why not call attention to that? Is that like an ad hominem attack that we're not going to like sink to that level? Why not just attack Smith? Why be so focused on saving someone who maybe can't be saved?
I attack Smith. I mean, but the other thing, remember, Smith, first of all, to get to your point, it's really hard to get beyond these texts. Even if we don't assign them in schools and people aren't taking liberal arts courses, they're still out there, they're still driving discourse, and we all still have relationships with them. So I think it's really important to get into that. Why is Smith so successful, and why does he have such a hold on us? Glory points out, this is a 1,200-page book. That's just the one. You're supposed to read it with the theory of moral sentiments that often contradicts itself, I will note, and often doesn't totally make sense, and also has to be read in historical context. By the way, Smith's idea of opulence, as someone pointed out to me a long time ago, was having enough to eat and clothes that keep you warm for the workers. He was not talking about like some kind of like East German vacation situation here. I mean, it was really basic 18th century. I mean, his idea of opulence is not what we would consider it even today, right? But therefore, because of the force of these texts, I don't think we should throw Smith out. He's big, it's part of our entire history. I think we should be hammering this out. And I think it's really important that we do. And what we're seeing from what you've said and what we've all said today, the stakes are really high in doing this. And if we don't do this, by the way, the fact that Gloria and I are being attacked by a newspaper which has the biggest circulation in the United States shows that there are real stakes in this. And as someone said to me, don't become between a person and their lunch. That's what you do when you criticize Smith. So I think what we're doing is really important. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. It's really super hard. But I think Smith's brilliant, but I also think he's kind of absurd. So I think that's also legit. I don't think I'm not hagiography. I mean, I definitely think Colbert is this brilliant guy, but I also think that he's a proto-authoritarian thug. A really gnarly dude. That's why I think he's so interesting. He's so bad and so brilliant at the same time. And so you don't have to love these people, that's for sure. I don't know if that answers. Maybe, Gloria, you have a more personalized relationship with them.
Not by much, but I'll just echo the point that Smith is complicated, right? And I totally support people saying, look, Smith is an economist. Look at all the ways in which he's thinking like an economist. And I'll say, yes. And then other people will say, look, Smith is a political realist. Look at the way in which he's thinking about kind of the historical contingencies of thinking about politics as a site of domination. I'll go, yeah. Or look, Smith is this kind of interesting 18th century sentimentalist. And I'll say, yes, right. And the thing is he's all these things. And the problem with, again, I don't have a problem with saying Smith is an economist, let's read him like an economist. I think the problem, or not, it's not even a problem, it's more, we can get more from Smith when we, instead of saying he's A or he can fit into this box, and instead ask, why does he think the things that he does? And again, maybe this is my disciplinary bias, but I think the most interesting way and the most helpful way we can extract that is by saying, what was preoccupying him? Like, why does he focus on like French taxation regimes in the 17th century, right? Rather than trying to say, was Smith in favor of progressive taxation or not, so that we can put him on the left or the right? Ask, why is he so obsessed with studying French taxation regimes in order to make the case that sometimes you need to favor certainty over progressivity, right? Because what mattered was reducing arbitrariness in power regimes. And you don't get to that conclusion unless you like slog through book 5 of The Wealth of Nations and try to understand what Smith is doing, rather than saying, how can we slot Smith into kind of one of our convenient boxes?
Yes, right on.
All right, I wanted to break in here very quickly.
That section on taxation is really boring. Okay.
I wanted to break in here really quickly to say it is 2:32, but due to the oddities of Berkeley Standard Time, since we started at 1:10, we'll go until 2:40 to give us the full 90 minutes. So I will give the last question to Mark Vail, who's waited patiently to the end of the queue here.
There, I'm unmuted. Thank you very much for the three panelists. This is a fantastic panel. I look forward to reading all 3 books. I know we're up against time here, so I'll be quick. This is a question for all 3 panelists, but I think primarily for Glory. And it's again about Smith, and it's related to some of the comments a couple of you, Jake and Glory, just made. You know, as you point out, Smith is doing a lot of things in The Wealth of Nations and elsewhere. On the one hand, he's trying to create a vision for the capacity for human flourishing and freedom in a commercialized society. And that, by definition, requires some limitations on despotic state power. On the other, he's leveling a critique against mercantilism, right? And so in my classes, I talk about both of these things and how they're related, but I'd be interested in your thoughts about the extent to which, can we disentangle those 2 things, or are they really integral parts of the same vision? And to the extent that we can you say a little bit about how and in the ways in which each of those 2 sort of influences or trains of thought shape his vision in that work and elsewhere? Thanks.
Thanks for that question. And I want to invite Jake and Brad to jump in on this too. I'll try to summarize my answer by saying yes. Yes. So the way that I think about this is really inspired by the work of the political theorist Paul Sagar, and I highly recommend his book. It's called Adam Smith Reconsidered: History, Modern Liberty, and the Foundations of Modern Political Thought, I think. Brilliant book. And the reading that I have of like, how do you reconcile Smith's critique of the mercantile system, but also his skepticism of state power and politicians, is to really separate out anti-statism from skepticism of concentrated forms of power and especially arbitrary power. Like, those are 2 very different things. I think Smith is more worried about concentrations of public and private power, arbitrary and uncertain, which is why the mercantile system is bad, and which is also why things like the Church of England and even like the medieval church are also bad, right? So concentrations of private and public power can do a lot of harm, especially to the most vulnerable. And what's wrong with the mercantile system is that you have this new class of people, the merchant elite, whose primary form of power is because they are wealthy and they're able to kind of dupe legislators into doing their bidding, and legislators just kind of go along with this. But the worst part about it is that they convince people that what they're doing is in the national interest, when in fact it's really only in their private interest, right? So being very wary of the way in which people position themselves in power in order to oppress the most vulnerable people. That's how I would kind of reconcile those two things. Now, Jake is nodding enthusiastically.
No, I just want to make this really, really clear that what Gloria just said about mercantilism is not what we think of mercantilism today. Smith says mercantilism is the undue influence of a business elite in government and a focus on industry and over agriculture, this class, all right? And then he becomes very Lockean in the idea that he wants this to somehow be fair. It does not mean gold hoarding or any of that. It does not exist. Mercantilism is a modern creation from the early 1930s, 1931, 1933. And so Smith is not against mercantilism. He is against a mercantile system, which is the rise of merchants in government. And that means a lot of things. That means who should be in government. And we get back to Locke, landowning, agricultural virtue, and Cicero. So I do think we are in a very, very, this is one of the things that the right is constantly attacking me on right now. No one says mercantilism. We probably shouldn't say it either. The mercantile system, according to Smith, that Gloria just completely gave a lesson on how to talk about Smith's ideas historically. I think this is super, super important. And here we are actually having this discussion. So I just wanted to make sure that that's really clear. By the way, his struggle with Colbert is super interesting. The antagonist of The Wealth of Nations is Louis XIV, but Colbert is the other figure. Oh, he did some bad things. Smith doesn't really know about it. He hasn't seen it in the archives, right? But he also did some good things, as Emma Rothschild pointed out to me on my second book, which I ended up going with and writing about Colbert. And I was stunned by, what I found. Smith is on the fence about Colbert. He's fascinated by him. He goes back and forth. I think that is much more interesting than the Smith versus Colbert silly pro wrestling thing that we've gotten in modern economics or The Economist magazine.
All right. Well, with that, we have been fantastically good about time management. So let me just do this, and that not necessarily necessary, but I wanted to take this last chance to thank our panelists again for first writing wonderful books that led to this excellent discussion, but then of course for taking the time today to discuss them together and to respond to our audience's questions. And I'd just like to close out by reminding everyone that stay tuned to your listserv. There will be 2 more events, as I mentioned at the beginning. A presentation by Professor Elizabeth Pop Berman on February 27th about thinking like an economist. And then about a month after that, a presentation by Professor Jennifer Pitts from the University of Chicago about W.B. Du Bois and views of the world shadow cast by democratic despotism. So on that light note, thank you to everyone, and I will call this officially to a close. Thanks again to our panelists.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.